David DeCosse, the Director of Campus Ethics Programs at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here at Santa Clara University. And we've had the great pleasure today of having with us Professor Douglas Laycock, the Robert E. Scott Distinguished Professor of Law and Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Professor Laycock is one of the national leading experts on religious freedom and has argued some of the most important cases on religious freedom before the United States Supreme Court. You've written extensively on the challenges to religious freedom in the United States today, and I'm wondering if you could tell us what you see those challenges to be.
Well, religious liberty has become deeply disputed. The right to believe is still fairly safe. The right to speak about your religion is still fairly safe. The right to actually practice a religion is now deeply contested. And for much of our history, if one of your religious practices ran afoul of some law, either from the legislature or from a court, you got an exemption, so you continue to practice your religion as long as you weren't actually hurting someone else. The Supreme Court backed away from that in 1990. Congress overwhelmingly passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to replace it. We just saw in Indiana, you can't pass a Religious Freedom Restoration Act anymore. They've become politically toxic, and many people on the secular side, particularly with respect to these sexual issues, same-sex marriage, contraception, abortion, have come to see religious liberty as a bad thing. Protecting religious practice empowers our enemies. We've got to make these religious people shut up, stay in their churches, but conform their behavior. So we're at a very difficult time with respect to the right to practice your faith in the United States.
Well, how do we move from this sense of conflict, say, between religious liberty and civil liberties in the United States? How do we find a better balance? I know you've referred to, for instance, recent developments in Utah as offering some promise of a kind of grand compromise that more Americans ought to think about, as we always are confronting these days these questions of religious liberty and sexual and gender issues.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that religious liberty is a civil liberty. It's a very important civil liberty. So the question is, how do we protect the civil liberties of committed religious believers and also the civil liberties of secular women and the gay community and all the different and sometimes polarized views that make up America. I'm not sure we can do it anymore. I'm not sure there's enough tolerance on either side to actually respect the liberties of the other. But the Utah bill that you mentioned is the most promising vehicle, at least in red states. Enact a gay rights law that fully protects the rights of gays against discrimination, and as part of that package, while you're doing it, also enact appropriate religious exemptions. And I think that would include most of the religious nonprofits, and I think it would include, although this is much harder politically, it would include very small individual businesses in the providing services for weddings and similar events directly related to marriage. All of that is very difficult to agree on. The gay rights side doesn't want to give any exemptions. Much of the conservative religious side doesn't want to enact a gay rights bill. There was strong leadership in Utah from the Mormon Church and from a gay legislator who had a good relationship with one of the Republican leaders. But they could only deal with part of the issue. They couldn't deal with the public accommodations piece. They couldn't work that out. So housing discrimination, employment discrimination against gays and against transgender is now illegal in Utah. That's quite an accomplishment. The religious exemptions made it possible, and that's an important accomplishment for religious liberty. And the bill was immediately denounced by both sides. The gay rights people said it's not a model for anything, it's only Utah, don't even think about it. They don't want religious exemptions even for the nonprofits. And many of the Republicans who voted for it were holding their nose and thinking that they'd given away too much. So it's extremely difficult to negotiate that kind of deal. And in blue states, it's too late. They already have marriage equality. They already have gay rights laws. So there's nothing left for the religious side to bargain over. In red states, gay rights with the religious exemptions is the way to go. It's the way to protect both sides. But it's very difficult to get there.
Very striking. For us at Santa Clara here at Jesuit University, we have followed closely the Catholic Church's engagement with topics of religious freedom in the last years in the United States. I suppose the chief instance of that being the kind of epic battle over the Obama administration's contraception rules and all. And you've written a great deal about that. You've also written very interestingly about the engagement of Catholicism with the contemporary sort of sexual and gender issues in terms of religious freedom, and some concerns you have about that approach in light of an analogy to the French Revolution. So I'll leave that delectable brew to you, but I wonder if you could tell us a little more about some of your concerns on the part of an institution like Catholicism with its invocation of religious freedom in light of the changing kind of sexual mores of our time.
Well, the bishops have been very out front on this, but it's not just Catholics, it's also evangelicals. The conservative religious community has been deeply resistant to the sexual revolution, and it's not new. Right? It goes all the way back to the beginning in the 60s, and you think about all the things that have changed. Sex outside of marriage used to be a crime everywhere. Gay sex used to be a crime. The Supreme Court invalidated that. Pornography and obscenity used to be tightly regulated. Now it's pretty much wide open. But the thing, and of course abortion. But the issues that people really care about are the right to choose abortion, the right to same-sex marriage, and now, because of the Affordable Care Act, the right to get free contraception from your employer. And the church and the evangelicals have been opposed to nearly every step of that, and they've been steadily losing. And as they put up religious freedom as an argument, they are drawing this resistance and denunciation of religious freedom. Religious freedom is coming to be a terrible thing as viewed from the left. And the analogy to the French Revolution is that the French law on religious liberty is nearly identical to ours. Protects free exercise of religion, it prohibits establishment of religion. It has been interpreted very differently. Setting aside the most current controversies in the United States, the historical tradition here, both legally and politically, much more protective of religious liberty. Very little protection in France under the very same language. And why is that? Because the church opposed the revolution, opposed not just its excesses, opposed its core, was deeply involved in periodic attempts at counter-revolution through the 19th century. The church defined itself as the enemy of liberty, and it had to be controlled, it had to be constrained, was the view of the Republicans, as the supporters of the French Republic, not our Republicans. And so we get this very narrow understanding of religious liberty in France. And we're starting to get the same thing here. The church has defined itself as the enemy of liberty in the view of many other people. And all these issues, same-sex marriage, contraception, abortion, sterilization, emergency contraception, they all have the same structure. What the church views as a grave evil, half the population views as a fundamental human right. And so the church has set itself up as the opponent of those fundamental rights, intruding itself into the most intimate and personal decisions, and there is blowback for that. There is payback for that, and it is fueling this opposition to religious liberty. It's a dangerous thing, and it may well be too late, but the church would have done better, I think, to concentrate from the beginning on protecting the liberty of the church and its members, and been much more laid back about restricting the liberty of the other side.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Douglas Laycock, the Robert E. Scott Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Virginia, for speaking here today and for being with us here at the Ethics Center. I invite all of you to follow Ethics Center activities at the website, at Santa Clara University, as well as on social media.